Settle in, perhaps beneath a warm blanket, and allow me to take you on a slow, unhurried journey through the life of a woman who embodied both the glitter and the hidden burdens of America's Gilded Age, Consuelo Vanderbilt. Her name alone conjures the shimmer of pearls, the whisper of silk gowns, and the measured footsteps of servants down long marble corridors. Yet beneath all of that, behind the smiles and the portraits, was a life shaped as much by constraint and duty as by luxury. Our story begins in 1877 in New York City, where Consuelo was born into two worlds at once. On one side, her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, heir to a vast railroad fortune, a man who lived in a sphere where money was less a tool and more an atmosphere, so ever-present it could be taken for granted. On the other, her mother, Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, a woman of formidable will, keen social ambition, and an unshakable belief that she was destined to stand at the very top of the social ladder. The Vanderbilts, though unimaginably rich, were relative newcomers to high society in the late 19th century. Their fortune had been made by William Henry Vanderbilt, Consuelo's grandfather, who had turned the already large fortune of Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt into something truly staggering. But wealth alone, in that era, was not enough for social acceptance among the old money families of New York, many of whom traced their lineage back to colonial times. To secure her place in those rarefied circles, Alva was determined to use her daughter as both an emblem and an instrument. Consuelo's childhood, then, was not one of idle play. She grew up surrounded by tutors, governesses, and rules. Her days were carefully scheduled: French lessons in the morning, music practice in the afternoon, elocution in between. She was trained to stand perfectly straight, to greet guests with poised charm, to converse in such a way that her words were neither too forward nor too meek. She was groomed, quite literally, for display, a living work of art to be presented at the right moment to the right audience. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilts had completed the enormous French chateau-style mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, and Consuelo's debut into society was nothing short of spectacular. Tall, slender, with large dark eyes and an air of quiet dignity, she immediately became the focus of attention. She was, in the parlance of the time, a prize, though of course this was meant in the context of society's marriage market. It was around this time that the phenomenon of the dollar princess was reaching its height. In Britain, many noble families were rich in titles but poor in funds, their great estates crumbling without the income to maintain them. In America, families like the Vanderbilts had money in abundance but lacked the ancient names and connections that came with centuries of aristocratic lineage. The solution, for those inclined to see it that way, was simple: aura. We have already walked with Consuelo Vanderbilt through the gilded halls of Fifth Avenue, down the echoing corridors of Blenheim Palace, and into the quiet sunlit corners of her later life in France. But her story does not simply end with an annulment and a second marriage. In truth, the decades that followed were filled with transformation. Slower perhaps, less glittering in the eyes of society, yet far more precious to her. When Consuelo left Blenheim, she did not leave empty-handed in spirit. She had gained something that no amount of pearls or gold could buy: a hard-won clarity about herself. For the first time since her girlhood, She could shape her days without the rigid expectations of a duchess's role. It was, however, an adjustment after decades of ceremonial duties, of hosting formal dinners and keeping pace with the strict social etiquette of the British aristocracy. She now faced the challenge of simply living for herself. Her marriage to Jacques Balsan in 1921 was a turning point. Jacques was, by the standards of his social set, a remarkable man. Not merely wealthy, but also inventive and adventurous. A pioneer aviator, he had been among the early enthusiasts of flight in France, flying rickety biplanes over fields and villages when aviation was still in its infancy. He was a man of warmth rather than rigid decorum, and he welcomed Consuelo into a life that valued companionship over ceremony. Together, they settled into a rhythm that combined travel, leisure, and philanthropy. They kept homes in both France and the United States, dividing their time between the French countryside, Parisian society, and the more relaxed coastal settings where they could escape the formality of city life. During these years, Consuelo's interest in charitable work only deepened. She had already been active in supporting causes related to children's welfare while in England, but in France her focus expanded. She became involved with initiatives that helped refugee children in the aftermath of World War I, a conflict that had left Europe deeply scarred. The war had not touched her directly in terms of material loss, but it had changed the social fabric around her, and she could not ignore the devastation it had brought to so many ordinary families. Jacques shared her compassion, and together they funded relief efforts, supported hospitals, and helped to rebuild communities. Consuelo, who had once been showcased as a symbol of inherited wealth, began to find her worth in the quiet, unpublicized act of helping others. Still, old society ties never entirely vanished. Even as she embraced a more private existence, she remained a figure of curiosity. She would receive letters from strangers, requests for interviews, and occasional visits from members of the press. Some sought her opinions on fashion, others on politics, and still others simply wanted a glimpse into her world. Consuelo, with her practiced poise, gave polite but measured answers. We have followed Consuelo Vanderbilt through the bright salons of Gilded Age New York, the echoing halls of Blenheim Palace, and the quiet gardens of her later years in France. Now, in this last part of our journey, we will linger with her not only as a figure of history, but as a witness, a woman who saw, over nearly 9 decades, the rise and fall of worlds. By the time the 1950s unfolded, Consuelo had lived many lives within one. She had been the debutante daughter of one of America's richest families, a duchess in one of Britain's grandest houses, a young woman coerced into a marriage of strategy, a philanthropic figure in England and France, the loving wife of Jacques Balsan, and finally, a reflective memoirist who had put her story into words for the world to read. Her later life was a season of slowness. After decades shaped by other people's demands, whether her mother's ambitions, her first husband's aristocratic obligations, or the polite pressures of society, she could now rise in the morning according to her own clock. She might have breakfast in the garden when the weather allowed, a simple tray with coffee, fresh bread, and butter, perhaps with letters from friends waiting beside her plate. Friends and acquaintances from across Europe and America still came to visit. Some were from the remnants of the old aristocracy, now living more modestly than in their youth. Others were artists, writers, or politicians who admired her poise and her story. Consuelo's home in France, though not on the scale of Blenheim, had a quiet beauty. High-ceilinged rooms with tall windows, simple but elegant furniture, and gardens that rolled out toward the horizon. It was here, in this gentle landscape, that she began to write her memoir. Writing was not something she undertook lightly. Though she had always been articulate in conversation, putting her life onto paper required a different kind of discipline. She worked slowly, often revisiting passages to ensure that her tone was neither too sentimental nor too harsh. She was determined that the glitter and the gold would be truthful, but not vindictive. And so she wrote of her mother's willpower, sometimes admirable, sometimes overbearing. She wrote of her own girlhood, filled with tutors and careful training. She described her love for Winthrop Rutherford, her resistance to marrying the Duke of Marlborough, and the wedding day when she walked down the aisle with tears hidden beneath her veil. She wrote of Blenheim, its grandeur and its loneliness, and of her growing dedication to charitable work. She told of the war years of displacement and of finding a home again. When the book was published, it received both praise and fascination. Society columnists wrote about it with a kind of nostalgia, calling her the last great duchess of the Dollar Princess era. Historians took note of her insights into the Gilded Age and the British aristocracy. For some readers, the memoir was simply an escape. When a life as long and tangled as Consuelo Vanderbilt's finally comes to rest, it leaves behind echoes, some loud in their day, others fading like the ripple of a stone cast in still water. By the time she died in 1964, the world had changed so dramatically that the Gilded Age felt like another planet. The ocean liners she had once crossed in splendor had been replaced by the brisk hum of jet airliners. The palaces she had graced as a young duchess now felt more like museums than homes. The very idea of marrying for a title seemed faintly absurd to the younger generation, who were busy dismantling the old codes of aristocracy. But for those who remembered her, not the photographs in the newspapers, not the glamour of a Vanderbilt fortune, but the woman herself, Consuelo's death was a soft closing of a chapter that had begun in a very different America. Her will was modest in tone, a far cry from the extravagant language of Gilded Age estate documents. She left certain personal possessions to friends and relatives, a brooch here, a small portrait there. To her sons, she left tokens rather than treasure. They had their own lives, their own fortunes, and perhaps most importantly, their own complicated memories of her. The funeral took place in a small French church not far from her home at Le Puy. It was a modest gathering. The pews were filled with a mixture of locals who knew her simply as Madame Balsan, old friends from her years in France, and a scattering of aristocratic names that still carried weight in certain circles. There were flowers, but not in profusion, just enough to soften the air with a scent of lilies. One of her elderly neighbors, a woman who had lived in the village all her life, remembered her in a way that never made the newspapers. She recalled seeing Consuelo walking in the gardens early in the morning, always with a scarf over her hair to protect it from the breeze, carrying a pair of clippers for the roses. There was no hint in that image of the girl who had once been paraded like a prize horse through New York society. When news of her passing reached England, a small notice appeared in the Times. It was respectful if understated. It referred to her as the former Duchess of Marlborough, as if that title still defined her, even though she had shed it decades before. It mentioned her charitable work, particularly her involvement in war relief and her efforts to support French hospitals during the Second World War. For all the drama that had surrounded her youth, history chose to frame her in her later years as a benefactor, not a beauty. In America, the obituaries were a touch warmer, tinged with nostalgia for an era long gone. Some recounted the story of her reluctant marriage, others her happier years with Jacques Balsan. The Vanderbilt name still drew attention, but it had lost the raw power it once wielded in the days when railroads shaped empires. By the 1960s, the Vanderbilt family was better known for Scattered. It is a strange thing, dear listener, to reach the autumn of life and look back upon a path once so brightly lit by chandeliers and whispered with the rustle of silk gowns. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, the final decades were not a sudden plunge from grandeur into obscurity, but rather a gentle dimming of the lights, a fading sunset over a long and eventful day. By the 1950s, Consuelo was no longer the bright-eyed debutante the newspapers had breathlessly reported upon, nor the reluctant duchess whose beauty had been sold for a palace and a title. The decades of struggle, the rigid English aristocracy, the cold halls of Blenheim Palace, the awkward dance of love and duty, had long since passed. In their place was something quieter, perhaps sweeter, a life lived largely on her own terms. Her home in the French countryside, near Avion-les-Bains, had become her sanctuary. Here, she tended gardens rather than courts, welcomed friends instead of reporters, and found more joy in a morning among roses than in an evening at a royal ball. The rooms smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers, and the tall French windows let in the afternoon light in such a way that it seemed to gild the very air. Visitors often remarked that the place felt alive, as though the house itself exhaled contentment. Jacques Balsan, her second husband, had grown slower in those years, but still kept a twinkle in his eye. They would sit together on the terrace, she with her letters, he with the day's newspaper, and share small observations about the changing weather or the progress of the climbing vines along the wall. For two people who had once lived lives dictated by duty and performance, there was peace in these small, uneventful hours. It was also in this period that Consuelo, with Jacques' encouragement, began sorting through her papers. There were letters from her mother, some sharp and businesslike, others unexpectedly tender. There were invitations from decades past, to coronations, to grand soirees, to the weddings of Europe's most illustrious families. There were photographs of her as a young bride, stiff and unsmiling beside the Duke, and others in which she was caught laughing, her head turned away from the camera. And then there were the clippings, yellowed with age, brittle at the edges, telling her own story as the world had seen it. Reading them was like looking into a distorted mirror. There was always truth, but never the whole truth. The scandal, the glamour, the whispers of affairs and unhappiness. They were there in print, but the quiet mornings, the secret acts of charity, the moments of shared laughter with her sons, those were nowhere to be found. Perhaps this was why she agreed, in her later years, to tell her story in her own words. Her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1953, was not a venomous settling of accounts, as some might have expected. Rather, it was a gently candid reflection, written in a tone that suggested more. We have followed Consuelo Vanderbilt through the great turning points of her life, the grandeur of her birth, the pressures of her youth, the splendor and shadows of her first marriage, the joy and steadiness of her second, and the quiet fulfillment of her later years. But before we close this story completely, let us wander, unhurried, through the world she inhabited. The world that changed so completely during her lifetime, and yet still held in its corners the echoes of the age she once ruled. When Consuelo was born in 1877, the United States was still in the afterglow of its own rapid transformation. Railroads crisscrossed the continent. Fortunes were being made at astonishing speed, and cities were growing taller, louder, and richer by the year. The Vanderbilt name, attached to railroads, steamships, and unimaginable sums of money, was a force in itself. The Gilded Age, as it would come to be known, was in full bloom, with its grand houses, elaborate balls, and quiet competitions for social standing. It was also an age of contrasts. The very wealth that built palaces along Fifth Avenue was mirrored by poverty in crowded tenements only a few blocks away. Consuelo, as a child, saw only the polished surface, the carriages, the silver tea services, the gowns brought from Paris. But she grew up in a country where change was always close at hand. The old families of New York looked down on the new industrial fortunes, even as they sometimes married into them. And young women like Consuelo were taught that their highest achievement might be to secure an advantageous match, one that would merge fortune and title. By the time she married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, the transatlantic marriage market was at its height. Dozens of American heiresses, often called dollar princesses in the press, crossed the ocean to marry into British and European nobility. For the families of the grooms, these marriages brought much-needed money. For the brides and their parents, they brought centuries of prestige. The arrangement was practical, but it was also a gamble. Not all unions succeeded, and not all brides found happiness in their new role. Consuelo's marriage was one of the most famous of them all, not only because of the grandeur of Blenheim Palace, but because she embodied the ideal image of the era. Beauty, poise, wealth, and youth. Yet beneath the diamond tiaras and official portraits, she carried the quiet weight of a life chosen for her. In that sense, she became a symbol twice over, a glittering prize for the world to admire, and a reminder that such prizes came at a cost. The years she spent as Duchess were marked by public duty and private restraint. She learned the rhythms of an English estate, the politics of aristocratic society, and the fine balance between tradition and adaptation. She hosted dinners for politicians and royalty, attended charity events, and maintained a household whose size and complexity would have been overwhelming. It was a late summer morning in the French countryside, the kind where the sunlight was soft and pale, as though it had been filtered through the haze of memory itself. At St. George Motel, Consuelo Vanderbilt's home for so many years, the garden was already alive with the scent of lavender and the hum of bees. The shutters were open, and the old house breathed easily, its walls soaked with decades of quiet conversations, letters written and answered, and the sound of footsteps on polished floors. Consuelo, now in her final decade of life, had grown into a rhythm that was far removed from the splendor and tension of her youth. She rose early, not out of necessity but from habit, and would sit by her window with tea, watching the light change across the lawn. Time no longer felt like something to be fought against. It was a companion, patient and inevitable. Her world had become smaller, but richer in texture. She had learned, after the frenzied demands of her younger years, that true luxury was not in the number of diamonds one wore or the height of a ballroom ceiling. It was in the ability to close a door, sit in silence, and simply exist. And yet, the past still had its way of visiting her. There were mornings when she found herself staring out at the garden and seeing, superimposed over its soft French colors, the blinding gold of a New York ballroom in the 1890s. She could almost smell the perfume of hundreds of orchids, hear the faint tinkle of champagne glasses. In those moments, the girl she had once been, the one drilled into perfect posture, trained in French phrases, and molded into the ideal debutante, seemed to walk beside her. Consuelo thought of that girl with a strange fondness. She had resented her at one time, resented the way she had smiled through teeth that ached from being clenched in politeness, resented the way she had obeyed her mother's every wish even when her own heart was breaking. But now, in her old age, she understood her younger self with something approaching forgiveness. After all, that girl had survived. In her study, the same room where she had written so many letters to friends scattered across England, France, and America, she kept a small box of photographs. There was Jacques, smiling broadly beside their yacht. There was the Duke, younger than she liked to remember him, posing stiffly in his uniform. There were her sons, one squirming impatiently on her lap, the other grinning shyly at the camera. And there was one photograph, worn and slightly torn, of herself at 18 in her wedding gown. Her eyes in that picture told the whole story. The gown was magnificent, the tiara heavy with stones. But the girl in the frame was looking past the camera, past the crowd, somewhere far beyond Blenheim's walls, as though she were already planning her escape. Sometimes she wondered what might have happened if she had refused the marriage. She knew it would have caused a scandal, her mother would ha. It was in the stillness of the French countryside that Consuelo Vanderbilt's final chapter quietly unfolded. By then, the noise of New York's gossip columns and the echo of grand balls in London had long faded into memory. The world outside was in constant motion. Wars were fought, nations reshaped, fashions turned over like pages in a restless magazine. But here, behind the ivy-covered walls of her home with Jacques Balsan, life slowed to the rhythm of sunlight and seasons. She was older now, her once coal-dark hair a silver crown, her figure softened by the gentle wear of time. Yet the grace never left her. There was still a certain poise in the way she sat at her writing desk each morning, letters spread before her, a fountain pen in hand, the steady scratch of ink marking another reply to a friend, a charity committee, or an old acquaintance from the days when dukes and duchesses still filled her diary. The world still remembered her, even if she no longer sought its attention. From time to time, a young journalist or historian would send a politely worded request for an interview. Most she declined. She had already written her account, the glitter and the gold, and felt there was nothing more to add. That book, in many ways, had been her great unburdening. An act of reclaiming her own life from the romanticized nonsense printed in society columns for decades. In the quiet of her study, she kept a copy near at hand. The spine was well worn, the margins filled with her own small notes, half reminders, half corrections, as if even in her final years, she was still fine-tuning the truth. Jacques, her second husband, had grown frilier with the years, yet he remained the steady center of her private world. They would often sit in the garden in the afternoons, she with a sun hat and a small pair of pruning shears, he with a walking stick and a small notebook in which he jotted idle thoughts. Sometimes they would speak, sometimes not at all. Silence between them was never awkward. It was the kind of comfortable quiet that comes only when two lives have been thoroughly intertwined over decades. Visitors were rare now, though not absent. Old friends from Paris would occasionally drive down to the countryside. Her sons visited when they could, though their lives in England and beyond kept them at a distance. She had a particular fondness for the moments when her granddaughters came to stay. They brought an air of lightness into the house, darting through the hallways, asking endless questions about the old days. She answered selectively, choosing to share the amusing and the charming, and setting aside the heavy shadows of obligation and heartbreak. The village nearby still regarded her with a certain polite curiosity. To them, she was Madame Balsan, a woman of refinement whose manner was gentle but whose history was storied. She was not one to flaunt wealth or status. Those were relics of another world. But she carried herself with an elegance that there is a peculiar kind of quiet that settles over a life once lived in the public eye. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, that quiet came not as a sudden plunge, but as a gradual fading of the stage lights. In the spring of 1950, the world was no longer the same one she had entered as a girl in New York's Gilded Age. The great mansions of Fifth Avenue were, one by one, giving way to apartment towers. The ladies who had once presided over glittering salons were now memories in brittle photographs. And the great dynasties, Vanderbilt, Astor, Whitney, were scattered, their fortunes diluted, their influence softened by time. But Consuelo still lived, and she lived with the peculiar blend of dignity and resignation that came to define her later years. Her life with Jacques Balsan in France had not been a fairy tale, not in the way young debutantes imagined when they read of her escape from Blenheim Palace, but it had been hers. There had been laughter and gardens, and a kind of partnership she had never known in her first marriage. It was late in life when she discovered that love, while never perfect, could at least be kind. In the mornings, she often sat by the large window of their house in Paris, the pale light spilling across her writing desk. There was always a cup of tea cooling nearby, and a fountain pen resting against her fingers. Her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, had been published some years earlier, and though it had caused murmurs among certain aristocratic circles, it had also given her something she had not expected: peace. By putting her story into the world, she had loosened the grip of its old sorrows. It was no longer a burden she carried in silence. Now it was a thing laid bare, open to the judgment of strangers, and strangely, that made it easier to live with. Jacques, ever the patient companion, would sometimes come into the room with a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Still writing letters?" he would ask in that lilting French accent that softened even the bluntest questions. And she would smile, a small, knowing smile, and reply, "Always," for though the days of grand audiences and royal introductions were gone, Consuelo still kept a small circle of correspondence. Some were old friends from her years in England. Others were younger women who had written to her after reading her book, seeking advice or reassurance. In their questions, she recognized shades of herself, that same blend of ambition, duty, and quiet rebellion that had shaped her own youth. It is tempting to think that her later life was without conflict, but such is rarely the case. The world outside was changing, sometimes faster than she could follow. Wars had swept across Europe twice, and though she and Jacques had weathered them with as much safety as possible, the aftermath was always visible. The streets she once strolled so easily now bore scars. Buildings blackened by fire, faces lined by ration years. And yet she had grown adept at finding